Chapter 8. Why is July? March, April, May. Those months of 44 BC had now sped by, filled with danger, change, and uncertainty for everyone. Liberals and conservatives, Democrats and aristocrats, friends of Caesar's and Caesar's enemies, had all been shaken by the upheaval. All had their lives greatly changed by Caesar's sudden and violent death. In January, on the calends, or the first day of the month, when the fatal year began, Antony had taken office as second highest in the Roman state, co-consul with Caesar. To him, Octavius was then merely a young nephew of Caesar's who had grown up down in the country somewhere and was at school in Apollonia. In February, at the Lupercalia, Caesar had refused the crown. In March, Caesar had been stabbed to death in the Senate. In April, the young Octavius had returned to Italy. In May, while Antony was away recruiting soldiers, the boy had slipped cautiously into Rome as a private citizen. Claiming to seek only his rights, he had established himself as Caesar's adopted son. Then he had made a speech, promising the people to carry out the terms of Caesar's will, whereby each one of them had been left a sum of money, and all were to receive his villa and gardens across the Tiber, where Cleopatra had been living, as a public park. Now, as June began, the ambitious young man was setting himself up as a serious rival to Marc Antony. Young, inexperienced, he was bracing his skinny legs and aiming his slingshot at the political giant. It was the beginning of a contest for power that was to go on for the next 14 years, to the very end exciting and uncertain. Octavian would finally emerge victorious, and the empire would be established. Then people would begin to tell the story of how on the very day that he first entered Rome, a radiant effulgence had been seen about the sun, predicting his radiant future. Octavian could see nothing very radiant as he left the house of Antony that May day after the stormy interview, but the month of June was well spent. First he appealed to Caesar's old friends for help, telling them how Antony had mistreated him. Then he undertook to raise all the money that he could, gathering together his own resources and borrowing more. His stepfather, mother, and 2 cousins loaned him all they had. He put the money to use at once, and with it, in the next month, Quintilis, he achieved a minor victory, and he won loud cheers from the mob. A motley lot they were, those common people of Rome, more foreigners than natives, speaking a medley of tongues: Gauls, Spaniards, Germans, Africans, Syrians, Greeks, Jews. They had come from all parts of the Roman world. From the backwoods of Europe and the crowded old cities of the East, they had been drawn or brought to this commercial, thriving and most Western metropolis. They were not, most of them, citizens interested in good laws, but a fickle, hungry lot, ready to cheer and cast whatever votes they had for anyone who would feed them well and pay for games to entertain them. In the month of Quintilis, it was up to Brutus and Cassius to furnish games in honor of Apollo. Having been praetors or judges, they dared not fail to do so, yet they dare not return to Rome. So they put up the cost, had someone else round up the gladiators and wild beasts, and the games went on. It was the 13th day of Quintilis, as the excited crowds went surging through the narrow, dirty streets that led to the circus. Hot, sweaty, under the blistering sun, breathing garlic, They jostled one another, shouting, laughing, cheering in a frenzy of joy, but not for the games. Not for Brutus and Cassius were they cheering, but for Octavian. Planning to make the games a flop, Octavian had shrewdly chosen that day to distribute the $15 each that Caesar had left the people in his will. Each citizen, therefore, in that crowd, butcher, fuller, baker, peddler, whatever, had in his hot, sticky fist more money than he could earn in a month, perhaps in 2 months. No wonder that they were shouting loud cheers for the dead Caesar, who had not forgotten his people, and loud cheers for the young Caesar, who had kept his promise. That was the first thing that Octavian did with his money, but not all. Later in the month, he too furnished games in honor of Caesar in his latest victory. For in celebration of all victories, the people expected games to be given by the successful general. Caesar had died too soon, so Octavian put them on. Once more, in that hot midsummer month of Quintilis, the streets were full of an uproarious holiday crowd, streaming out to take their seats on the long wooden grandstands of the Circus Maximus. There they would bet on their favorite gladiators as they strode in, flexing their strong, naked muscles, glistening with olive oil. Or they would argue and wager about the comparative strength of the lions, pitted against each other, whose deep roars as they caught the human scent could be heard through the uproar of the crowd and the shrill blare of the trumpets. Wild beasts tearing each other to pieces, and the young men hacking each other to death. That made a wonderful spectacle for the Roman crowd, a thrilling and successful day. One thing only marred it for Octavian. He had hoped to display the glittering crown of golden laurel leaves that Caesar had been allowed to wear, and also his golden chair, but that had been forbidden. Something far more thrilling, however, than the sight of those tokens of earthly power and glory took place that very night. As it grew dark, a comet of unusual brilliance flashed its wide arc across the sky. Looking up, the people could see, as they were told, that it might be the soul of their great leader, Julius Caesar, whose genius had been so much greater than that of average men, as to seem to be that of a god on earth, had now gone to take his place among the stars of heaven, the everlasting gods. On the strength of this heavenly sign, Octavian had a new statue of the god Julius, Divus Julius, made with a gold star on his forehead, and placed in the temple of his ancestor Venus. Also possibly influenced by that omen from on high, the Senate issued a decree that the month in which the great event had taken place should no longer be known as the 5th month Quintilis. Henceforth it should bear Caesar's clan name, Julius, or July. All our months still carry their old Roman names. Our entire calendar, not just the 1 month of July, is a memorial to Julius Caesar. Though it was made more accurate by Pope Gregory in 1582, the calendar we use today is still practically the same one that was made for the Romans by Julius Caesar the year before he died. For nearly 20 years, Caesar had been Pontifex Maximus, the chief Roman priest, in charge of announcing each month and its events. But the Roman calendar was such a mess that half the time he hardly knew himself when a month began or what it was. The idea of making a new calendar had occurred to him in Egypt. During the winter spent with Cleopatra, Caesar had seen the Egyptians using a far better calendar. It had then been in use for more than 4,000 years, having been made by one of those ancient pharaohs whose pyramids he had visited with Cleopatra on their journey up the Nile. On his return home, Caesar had sent for an Egyptian astronomer by the name of Sosigenes to come to Rome and work out a calendar for him, one that would keep the names of the old Roman months but leave out their connection with the moon. It was figuring by the moon, Caesar saw plainly, that caused the Romans all their trouble. The Egyptian calendar paid no attention to the moon. Each year had 12 equal months of 30 days, with 5 extra feast days added to the end, which made 365. The Romans used a moon or lunar calendar, which had been handed down to them by way of Greeks from the ancient Babylonians. It also had 12 months, but each one was truly one month, as well as 1/12 of the year. That is, each new moon started a new month, but when several nights were cloudy, and the man on watch for it failed to catch sight of the new moon, who could tell when the month began? Also, 12 of those moon months made only 354 instead of 365 days. So the year was always too short. The months kept coming around too soon and getting out of season. Spring months turned up before winter was over, summer months came in early spring, and so on. Sosigenes found, when he reached Rome, that the year 46 BC had come out about 90 days too short. So the first thing he and Caesar did was to tack on 3 extra months. Then they figured out new months, discarding the moon entirely. The Roman priests, some of them, were horrified. They said it was sacrilegious to give up the old way. But Caesar wanted a calendar that would keep itself in order, not one that only the high priest could manipulate. This calendar of his would have 365 days, he had thought, just like the one in Egypt. But Sosigenes had said that he could make one still more accurate. 365 days were not exactly the correct number in a year. We now know, he said, that it takes the sun about 1/4 of a day more than that to travel around the earth, or 365 1/4 days. Caesar was determined to have the best and most scientific calendar that could be made, including that 1/4 of a day. Thus it was set up, that calendar which we have inherited and which was made originally in ancient Egypt at the very earliest date recorded in history, the year 4241 BC. 45 BC was the first year that this new Julian calendar was put into use. To the Romans, who counted time from the founding of their city, the year was 709. 709 years it was said to have been since Rome had been founded by Romulus, one of those famous twins, who had been brought up by a wolf. Mars, the god of war, was supposed by the early Romans to have been the father of those twins, and it was for him that they had named what was then the first month in their year, Martius or March. January, which later took first place in the calendar, was named for Janus, another early god, who had 2 faces, showing that he could look both to the past and to the future. He was the gatekeeper of heaven, and from early times a temple to Janus, in the shape of a great gate, had stood near the Forum. In times of war the gate stood open, but it was to be closed in those rare times when Rome was at peace. Only twice so far had that gate been closed. never during Julius Caesar's lifetime. Now, at his death, Rome was to be plunged into 14 more years of civil war. Possibly old Janus, looking to the future, could see the end of it, but no one else. Caesar's enemies and friends were marshaling their forces. Mars, bloodthirsty god of war, was sharpening his sword.